Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we have a really great show lined up for today. I hope everyone's been doing well and have been gearing up for Christmas time. I actually just got wind that a friend of mine from college will be coming back into the area for the holiday, so very excited to see him. He lives in California, so when he comes into town, all of my friends from college get together. It's always nice to, try and reconvene, see how everyone is doing. Obviously, pretty hard seeing people in the circumstances that we are going through right now in the world with the pandemic. So whenever we can, in a safe way, we will get together to hang out and catch up. It's always great to get back together with the gang. But anyways, diving into today, we have a sensational show. A lot of news going on with a lot of different MLB free agents now becoming free agents. Recently, we will also have another, hypothetical question segment later on. So I'll get into all of that. But I'll first dive into some of the latest news going around the MLB and discussing any of the latest developments on free agency and really anything else. And after that, I'm going to get into discussing some of the newest players to become free agents and which of those new free agents might be the best available and potentially steals in this offseason. Later on, I'll dive into what has been going on in the finances of the MLB and what some of these significant losses could mean for the MLB moving forward into 2021. And be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I will pose another hypothetical scenario, which will include which starting pitcher would be the most likely candidate for you to start a playoff game. I'll get into which players I would and could see in that situation and who I would ultimately want in that scenario. So we've got a really big jam-packed show ahead of us today, but I want to stay right here, jump into some news, and there's, again, a lot of different things been moving with all the different free agencies and all the different free agents becoming free agents. But there was also a recent trade that, for whatever reason, I felt, well, I shouldn't say went under the radar. I think it was one of the more talked about trades, at least in the last week or so, because it was really the most significant one. I mean, there was really the only one, in all honesty, and that was Corey Knebel, the former All-Star reliever for the Milwaukee Brewers, being traded to the LA Dodgers for a player to be named later or cast, one of the two. And I think this is going to be a really great get for the Dodgers. I think that with Blake Trinan now being a free agent and most likely leaving because of free agency, you now bring in somebody who is, in my opinion, I mean, on a lot of teams, he's a closer. He is a bona fide closer. He's a very good pitcher. He was an all-star before with the Brewers. And not to mention, if Blake Trinan is going to be leaving due to free agency, stepping in is Corey Knebel, who I think is much better than Trinan, and he'll be that setup guy that can set up for Kenley Jansen, who comes in. And not to mention, I mean, who knows, if Jansen gets injured or whatever, they then can go to, Corey Knebel, and Knebel, I think, again, is just as capable of being that good of a closer. He has shown it before, and now I will say he has battled injuries before, coming off of a Tommy John surgery in 2019. So really not a great 2020 for him. I mean, at 6.08 ERA, he only pitched 13 and a third innings, 15 Ks and 8 walks, and he only was, played in 15 games. So, the 2017 All-Star, kind of a different pitcher that he was in 2020. But again, that injury is really hard to come back from. And I've talked to a lot of people that have had that injury, and they always say the first year or so coming out of that big of a surgery, you're not really back to normal. You don't really feel like your normal pitching self, for a little bit. And then you slowly get back into a normal rhythm again. So hopefully that was just kind of this year. He was trying to work out the kinks a little bit. Again, completely out of baseball for all of 2019. So, and then you get, thrown into kind of this pandemic-filled season. coming off of that big surgery, not really a whole lot of room to work with, in my opinion. And yes, he did lose a lot of velocity, but he started to show signs of picking it back up later on in the season. So again, good sign going into next year in 2021. And I think that if, the Dodgers are coming in, they're bringing really good relievers. I mean, you're bringing in a very good, a former All-Star, really. And in 2017, it was no shock that he was an All-Star. I mean, a 1.78 ERA in 76 innings. He struck out 126 and only walked 40. And again, in 76 innings, that's quite a bit of pitchers or batters to pitch or to strike out, especially if you're a reliever and you're coming in kind of that closer situation, if you will. So I think this is a really good get for the Dodgers. Ultimately, I think it's going to set them up really, really well for next year. I'm curious to see what other adds that they make because, again, they have an opening potentially over at third base with now Justin Turner being in free agency right now. Who knows if he'll re-sign? And then you also have Kiki Hernandez over at second base. He's a free agent. Who knows if he'll re-sign? So you've got a couple pieces that you might have to move around, and you might have to go out and get some new guys. And I think that, addressing the bullpen first and foremost is definitely very important. And again, if you had a really solid setup guy this year in Blake Trinan, and you elevate it this year or this upcoming year with Corey Knebel, I think you're going to, really put yourself into a better position next year than you were this past year, and you won the World Series. So to the Dodgers, congratulations. I thought that was a very, very good move on your part. And also, I think, again, you're going to have a very, very legitimate and reliable reliever to set up one of the best closers in baseball in Kenley Jansen. So we'll see how that kind of pans out with the Dodgers and what other kind of moves they make. But again, as I get into, this next part of this segment, talking about some of these players that were non-tendered, there was actually 60 players that were non-tendered and allowed to enter free agency. So again, some teams making some serious cuts from their payroll for probably numerous reasons, one of them being this pandemic and, the losses that these teams have endured. I know a lot of teams have really started to kind of put the clamps down financially on some of their money spending and some of their payroll because they want to be careful. Because again, as I'll get into it in a couple segments from now, who knows what next 2021 holds for baseball. And baseball already saw a large amount of losses. And as a result, they're going to have to do something. And I think one of the first steps was a lot of these teams letting some of these otherwise pretty talented players walk. But one of those really, in my opinion, fairly talented players and recent players to become free agents has already really elicited kind of as an interest from some teams, and that's Eddie Rosario, the former Twins outfielder. He's actually caught the eye already of the Boston Red Sox. Now, I think that this would be an interesting move for a couple reasons. One, as we all know, Jackie Bradley Jr. is going to be a free agent. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, Chris Bryant was subject to being traded over to the Boston Red Sox back during the trade deadline because what they were trying to do was move Andrew Benintendi over from left field over to center field. Then they would have inserted Chris Bryant over into left field because he plays third base, but you already have Rafael Devers over at third base. So you're not going to touch that because, again, in my opinion, I've mentioned this numerous times and I will continue to mention it, but I think that he's one of the top up-and-coming players that, you usually hear about Fernando Tatis or you hear about, Ozzie Albies or Ronald Acuna or Juan Soto. I feel like Rafael Devers sometimes gets lost in the mix, and he should be paid a little bit more attention to. I think he was very, very good in his rookie year. He showed it, over 30 home runs as a 22, 23-year-old. That's not easy to do. He might have been 21 at the time, actually, but nonetheless, being able to, if you play this scenario out, so let's say Jackie Bradley Jr. doesn't re-sign, and they wind up moving Benintendi over to center field because he is pretty athletic. He does cover ground pretty well. I know that his performance has kind of taken a little bit of a downward trend each and every year. And I actually saw an article where some teams and some scouts are actually worried that he might not ever get to that level that people thought he was going to because he's starting to age and he's just not trending in the right direction. So who knows what will happen with that. But again, back to Eddie Rosario. If you go ahead and pick him up, you can stick him in the left field, and you've got yourself a really, really good bat. Sure, his 2020 numbers weren't sensational. They were fairly solid, though. I will give him that. 13 homers, 42 RBIs, a 257 average, a 792 OPS, and a 115 OPS plus. So there's definitely numbers to work with in that, little stat line right there. I mean, if he's got 13 homers in a pandemic-filled season, 42 RBIs, that's one of the higher numbered, RBI hitting seasons that a lot of these hitters have had this past year. And as a result, I think that, this is somebody that is going to catch the eye of not just the Red Sox, but a lot of other teams because, again, you could get somebody like this for a bargain. You could get him for very, very cheap, not to mention Alex Cora and Eddie Rosario. They have history. They were both on the Puerto Rican national team together, so there's a little bit of chemistry already with the manager that might entice him a little bit more to come. And again, with Jackie Bradley Jr. not there, they do have an opening out in the outfield. Not to mention, 2019 was a career year for Eddie Rosario. I mean, he had 109 RBIs. He had a career high in slugging percentage at 500. And, I mean, that's not too far removed. I mean, he's not too far removed from that really strong year at the plate. I will say he does have some issues patience-wise from the plate. I mean, he's had 2 years where he struck out over 100 times, and he'd not collected 40 walks in those 2 years. So somebody that does have a high strikeout rate, but that's usually going to happen with a high power hitter, somebody that hits a lot of home runs, a lot of RBIs, they're going to be swinging at probably a much more frequent or a higher frequency and they're much, harder swings, much more power-oriented hitting in order to try and get and maximize the most out of those hits. And somebody like Eddie Rosario, I think, would be great for this team, especially when you have Xander Bogaerts, who's been playing pretty well. I mean, he had a very good year this past year. Rafael Devers struggled for the most part, but then he picked it back up a little bit. J.D. Martinez did not have a very good year, but imagine if he has another good year. You've got those 3 guys already in this lineup, and then you add Eddie Rosario. I think that he can be kind of that X factor for the Red Sox, where a lot of teams will pay attention to Devers and Martinez, but they won't really pay much attention to Rosario, and he could kind of be that sneaky X factor that, in the bottom part of the lineup, 6'7" hitter, all of a sudden he's the one that's got, 3 for 4 from the plate, and he's got 2 RBIs, and he's really been the run producer for them in that game, whatever it might be. So I think that Rosario would be a great fit for them. Ultimately, I think that if they do move things around in the outfield, I think it will probably increase the likelihood of this happening all the more. And I would love to see it happen, honestly. I mean, I think that they could really benefit from another power-hitting bat. And not to mention, if, you've got, that situation, you don't want to just have, a very thin outfield with kind of a, who knows what you'll get out of the infield. And if your outfield is not doing so hot, we saw a perfect example with the Cleveland Indians. Their hitting in the outfield was atrocious this year, one of the worst OPS outfields in the entire MLB. And you can see how that really kind of trickles down into the rest of the hitting and the rest of the playing on the team. So I think the Red Sox would be wise to go after Eddie Rosario. But we'll see what happens with that. But there were also a lot of, some other pretty big trades, I'd have to say, that was actually involving a West Coast and an East Coast team. The Angels and the Orioles were two main subjects of this trade. The Orioles traded away Jose Iglesias to the Angels in exchange for 2 minor league right-handed pitchers. So, again, another big ad by the Angels. And I think that this is a huge move, and here's why. They lost Tommy La Stella either his contract was up or it was at the trade deadline, one of the two, and he went over to the Athletics, and I think that was one of the biggest pickups during the trade deadline this past year because La Stella played sensational when he went over to the Athletics. Right now, the Angels' infield is looking pretty thin hitting-wise, and you've got Anthony Rendon over at third base, obviously, and then Pujols will be at first. But then, the middle part of that lineup, it's kind of like, well, who do you, what do you have there? What are you gonna, Andrelton Simmons, he was up for free agency, so there was a hole over at shortstop, and not to mention, Jose Iglesias had an insane year. He had a really, really good year. Now, there's a couple catches to his really, really good year. He only played in 39 games, but he still batted .373. He had a .956 OPS. He had a 160 OPS plus. Clearly his best season by far, and I think that there is no question about it. But you know what? He's also had other years where he's played over 100 games, and he's batted over 300. You're looking at 2013, he played in 109 games, and he batted .303. And then in 2015, when he was an All-Star, played in 120 games, and he batted .300. So it was really his OPS numbers that you look at that are way higher than they were in previous years. I mean, first year that he was above 900, he had never gone higher than, 780, 785, somewhere in that general area. And this is clearly the highest OPS plus number season that he had as well, never having a year above 120 in OPS plus. So clearly, I think you're getting him at the right time in his career. Yes, there is, some question as to whether or not he can put up those kind of numbers in a full season. But as I just mentioned, he's clearly capable of doing that. He's 30 years old, a decent age to kind of go in and try and, get somebody right in their peak and right in their prime of their career. But again, I think that having Iglesias and then Rendon both on the left side of the infield, that brings a lot of pop into the lineup. And I think that you can really add a little bit more of depth into, this batting lineup, not to mention, you never know with Mike Trout, even though he's been incredible, he's been the best player in baseball, arguably, for the last 10 years, he is injury prone, as we have seen it. He gets banged up, he gets nicked with something, and he could go down. So I think that Iglesias, he could be kind of a reliable bat to have in case somebody goes down. And although, even though, the small sample size from hitting this past year, it could be misleading, he did bat .288 in 2019, okay? And he did have a career high in 2019 as well in home runs and RBIs. He had 11 homers and 59 RBIs. So, and he's actually had 3 straight years from 2017 to 2019 of 45 RBIs or more. So a guy that is, okay, obviously not a huge power hitter, but he's a guy that is a run producer. He will add, some sort of value into your lineup. And I think that you're just continuing to add a little bit more each and every year. And I think this Angels team, maybe not this upcoming year, but maybe a couple years down the road, they could have a really, really good season. And they could start, this could be the beginning of them building up a little bit each and every year into a playoff contending and potentially World Series contending team. Who knows how fast that'll happen, because, again, you want to do it probably within Mike Trout's prime. He's still in his prime, but you want to do it in some relative time frame that's not 10 years from now, obviously. But I think that if they keep adding a piece here, a piece there, trying to pick up somebody here, trying to pick up somebody there, I think that they could quickly put themselves into the conversation of being a playoff team, which they have not been in quite some time. So I'm really curious to see what's going on over in LA this upcoming season. And, you always hear all the rumors about them trying to go after Trevor Bauer because he's from LA and all this other stuff. So that could be another very interesting get for them. That would really put yourself into a playoff conversation if you add Trevor Bauer. And case in point is the Cincinnati Reds. They added him. He's there for a year and a half, and he takes them to a playoff. So clearly somebody that is going to make that big of a difference. But we'll have to see how that winds up. Now, this has nothing to do with free agency or trades, but rather just a very interesting story that I came across on MLB.com. Again, I always try and find all the news and everything, insightful that I can really get a hold of on MLB.com or Bleacher Report or The Athletic. All these other different sites are fantastic. I love ESPN, but, MLB.com, I think really, it's focused, it's centralized, and it's all about baseball, right? But also, again, this article actually involved the method behind the way baseballs are actually stored at Coors Field in Colorado for the home of the Colorado Rockies. Now, what was very interesting about this is because Colorado is known as a hitter's ballpark. Okay, the air is very thin, the ball carries very, very far, and a lot of pitchers have said in the past that their pitches won't break when they're supposed to break. There's not as good as rotation on certain pitches because of the air and kind of the way that the ball, I don't know, again, it's some scientific way behind it, but I think the way the ball spins and with the thinness of the air, I guess that it doesn't, the physics of it doesn't really align with how it should. And so a lot of pitchers obviously have a very hard time pitching in Coors Field, and as a result, that's why they call it a hitter's ballpark, because and they try to actually overcompensate for that by having a larger outfield than any other outfield in all of baseball. And as a result, though, it's still been kind of a challenge because some of these outfielders, they don't know how to read fly balls. They don't know if they should play too deep, and then there's a little shallow pop-up in front of them that they don't get to. They play too shallow, and then there's this long, deep drive way over their head, and they can't get to that. So the point of this and how they're storing the baseball is to create some sort of, moisture, if you will, or moisture-reducing, moisture-controlled environment is what they called it, but basically trying to allow the ball to be, carry properly, be thrown properly, all of this other stuff. So I'm really curious to, kind of see how this might unfold and how other MLB parks might implement this or not. But basically, they created this thing called a humidor. And again, it stores baseballs at a certain temperature in a moisture-controlled environment. They're stored at 70 degrees, and it's 50% humidity, and it's in a 9 by 9 foot and 7 foot tall chamber. So it's basically like this large meat locker. And they actually had a couple of cool pictures. Some of the guys in this large baseball storing chamber, if you will, and they're just sitting there, kind of just messing with the ball. Apparently you get a better grip on the ball with this. Pitchers say that they have better command and better control of their pitches in this method. So it's definitely something that works, and guys do like it. And again, it prevents baseballs being crushed constantly. Allows the balls to have better break. And the drier climate allows balls to not expand and dry up. And that's what really kind of makes baseballs easier to hit, is when they expand and they become dry. And they were actually saying in the article that there was a couple examples that they would do where they would have one of the balls that was not stored and one of the balls that was stored, and they would just bounce both balls. And the ball that was not stored would bounce so much higher because there was no moisture in it and was so dry that it would just carry. It just bounced and went straight up. But the other ball didn't bounce nearly as high. So it's something that definitely, there's a proven science. It clearly works. Obviously, no matter what, you can't change anything about the air and the altitude in Denver. But at the end of the day, I think it's very it's a very ingenious way of trying to figure out, hey, let's try and correct this problem. And not to mention, again, more technology in baseball. We're starting to see that more and more, and I think that, other stadiums, they might start implementing that. Who knows? I don't know if there's really any other stadiums out there that have the issue of the altitude like Colorado does, but at the end of the day, no matter what, I think that we're starting to see a continuous trend of technology starting to become implemented more and more in baseball, and as a result, we're starting to see the game change a little bit. So who knows what will happen out of this? Maybe we'll start to see other teams implement that and have these kind of baseball storing chambers. But regardless, I think it's a very wise idea by the Colorado Rockies to try and fix this issue that they have with baseballs just being hit and flown way out of the park. So that'll do it for us in this first segment, but stay right there, folks, because after the commercial, I'll discuss which players who recently became free agents are going to be some of the biggest targets for teams in this offseason. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenour with you all, and in our first segment, I got right into the latest news going around the MLB. I mentioned a couple moves that have been made recently and anything else involving this offseason. Be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I will jump into discussing which starting pitcher you'd rather have to start in a playoff game. I'll play out the scenario and then pick which pitcher I would want in that case. But I want to now get into some of the latest free agents that have become free agents recently, because there were a number of players who wound up getting non-tendered a few days ago. So basically a lot of teams just said to some of these guys that were up for arbitration this year, hey, we're going to just let you go. We're going to let you walk, explore free agency, good luck moving forward. And I think there was about 60 players in total. I think a couple wound up getting re-signed, and so it went down to about 55 or 56. But there was quite a bit of players that wound up getting non-tendered, which was, again, very alarming. I mean, I had never seen a number that high in my entire life of players that were just wound up letting go for pretty much, for free agency. So I'm going to get into a couple of the names, couple of the guys that I really kind of caught my eye and I was very intrigued by, that could possibly become kind of sleeper picks in this free agency market. So the first one I want to mention is Hanser Alberto, former player for the Baltimore Orioles, and he was a very, very good infielder for them. I mean, I think what's very ideal for Alberto is that he can play multiple positions. He can play third, he can play second, he can play shortstop. He can play a lot of different positions in the infield, and so I think that it kind of opens the door for possibilities of where he could land even more than some guys that are just strictly DHs or that are strictly center fielders. With his versatility in the infield, I think it kind of opens the door for possibilities and for him to really go anywhere that he would like. In 2019, he actually had a very, very good year. He batted .305. He had 12 homers, 51 RBIs. They were all career highs. And the stats were fairly non-existent before 2019. So you can definitely see that there's a little bit of a rise in his performance and his production and his career. And again, I think that could be something that would be very, very important for a lot of these teams to see and kind of realize that, hey, this guy before 2019 was not doing so hot, but then in 2019 he had a really, really good year. 2020, honestly, he wasn't that far behind. Again, we played a fraction of the games as they did in 2019. So he had 3 homers and 22 RBIs, very different from, 12 homers and 51 RBIs. But in all honesty, if that was his numbers through 60 games or so, let's just say, I'm sure he probably would have been well onto his way in close numbers to what he had in 2019. He had a .283 average in 2020 and then a .698 OPS. So not a great power guy, not a guy that's going to hit, for great power. He's never had an OPS plus above 100. He had 160 hits last year, which really jumped out at me, about 550 plate appearances. So, a good portion of the time that he's up at bat, he's getting a hit. Not to mention, he's a low strikeout guy. He only struck out 50 times in 550 plate appearances in 2019. So somebody that is going to be very patient. Now, his on-base percentage is not great. It's never been higher than .350, so he doesn't have a really good on-base percentage. But if he's, again, not striking out, he's at least getting active outs. He's at least putting the ball in play and giving, if somebody's on base, an opportunity to advance or score or something. So he's at least, going up and swinging, and he's not just sitting there and letting pitches go by him and taking pitch after pitch. So I think Alberto would be a very interesting player to have on really any team, but in particular, I think the Blue Jays would be a likely candidate, the Oakland Athletics, the Marlins. They're all low payroll teams. I don't think he's going to get some crazy contract because I just don't see in his career and really in the numbers he's put up any sort of reason to give him some long, very serious contract, especially with all these teams losing money in the pandemic year and whatnot. But I think that, he's a steady infielder with a good bat. All 3 teams have openings at different spots in their infield. The Marlins have an opening at second. Oakland has an opening at second. The Blue Jays have an opening at third. I think Alberto would be very interesting to insert over at third base for the Blue Jays. You'd have Gurriel. You'd also have Teoscar Hernandez. You have Vladdy Jr. You've got a lot of different, Bo Bichette, obviously. And I think that Alberto and Bo Bichette, they would be interesting to see kind of how that left side of the infield would work. And not to mention, it would probably be a pretty solid hitting lineup, too. A great addition into the lineup for sure. So it'll be interesting to see where Alberto lines up. But I think that he's going to get a nice contract, nothing huge, but I definitely think he's one of the more under-the-radar free agents that I think teams should pay a little bit more attention to. So the next guy that I want to mention is Delino DeShields. He's a very interesting case. He's had average numbers, but this past year, he had his second highest batting average in his career. He doesn't have great OPS numbers. He's under, 700 OPS the last 3 years. But as a center fielder, he could be a potential commodity for teams. Again, the center fielder position is pretty open this year. I wouldn't say it's wide open, but there's a lot of teams that are going to have to fill that need out in the outfield. And he was part of that very poor hitting outfield for the Indians. Again, not a great OPS outfield, and he was one of those reasons why. But he's somebody that has had much better success recently as opposed to before. And I think that, when he was in Texas, he was pretty decent. He had 1 year, 2 years where his average was above 260. But other than that, the OPS has never gone higher than 718. So he's not a huge power hitter guy. And, he did have, pretty steady RBI numbers for the most part. But I don't think he's somebody that is going to make a major, major impact. But I think what could be interesting about him is this. It's a case where you could get him for a bargain, and he could have a huge year, and you got him for a fraction of the cost. And then if you think about it down the road, and if you're looking kind of long-term, then you could kind of use him as maybe trade bait, and you could use him as a piece in some bigger move to try and get somebody else down the road. You obviously have to hope that he's going to have a really, really good year, because if not, then you've lost X amount of money. But I think that this is going to sound really crazy where he could land, but I could see him landing with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And here's why. They need a center fielder because the Pirates batted a collective 180 this year for out of all the guys that played center field. That is literally their collective average. Sure, Reynolds, he just had a down year. I think that Brian Reynolds is very, very good, very talented baseball player, one of the better up-and-coming players. Honestly, if he wasn't on the Pirates, he probably would be talked about much more. But then you have Gerard Dyson, that was just a head-scratcher of a pickup. I don't know why they signed him. And then Cole Tucker hasn't really found his stride yet from the plate. So I think that if you stick in DeShields, you could get him again for a fraction of the cost, not a big purchase, but at the same time, you could get a lot of production out of him as a player, somebody that could be very good maybe next year or the year after, and then all of a sudden you've got yourself a nice added piece that was kind of a pleasant surprise, if you will. And if you're able to get him for cheap, I think that is going to be very, very ideal. But again, I think that, his numbers aren't stellar. I think that his numbers could obviously, go up, but I mean, his batting average was better than the entire center field for the Pittsburgh Pirates. So not that bad of a job, by him. Now, he didn't have any home runs this year, 7 RBIs, 252 average. Three of the last 4 years, actually, he's led the league in sack hits. So, again, showing his ability to move guys over, advance guys over. He's a guy that is going to, potentially be that kind of setup man from the plate for different guys on the base path and whatnot. So I think DeShields would be an interesting one for sure. I think that he could definitely wind up somewhere decent. He's not going to be on a contending team, but I think that there will be a team out there that is looking to, take a shot, take a gamble, and I think that they'll take a shot on DeShields. Now, the next guy I want to mention, he's actually been playing very well, and I think he could be a very sneaky pickup for a lot of teams, and that's Maikel Franco. And Maikel Franco, he was very good for the Royals this past year. And I think that he's got solid power numbers. He's had one of the better years of his career this past season. And another player that, again, could be acquired for a bargain, that could turn out to have a quality season for, again, a great price. He had the third highest average on the Royals, and he led the team in RBIs with 38. He had a very, very good season across the board. He had 8 homers, 278 average, a 778 OPS, a 109 OPS plus. He had a pretty solid year, and not to mention, if you've got those solid high RBI numbers, solid power numbers across the board, it could be a very good fit for a lot of different teams. He could be a really nice kind of 5-6 hole hitter that could pose a threat on a team that has a superstar or two. Again, if you add some of these guys that have, threatening bats and that are capable of making some sort of, legitimate move towards being a very good player, then it kind of takes the attention away from those already established superstars. Now pitchers are having to worry about not just the superstar, but also this other guy that is in, the 6 hole, and he can do a lot of damage, because if you surrender any base runners 3 through 5, you're in for a rude awakening, because again, you're picking up somebody who led their team a year ago in RBIs. So a couple teams that I think could possibly get him and could be very interesting would be the Brewers. They definitely need a corner guy at third base with a bat, especially after last year. They struggled across the board as a team, and not to mention Moustakas left. Shaw's not there anymore, so they've got an opening there. And if they don't exercise, that option on Jed Jerko and they let him go, Franco could be a nice addition for the Milwaukee Brewers. Cincinnati Reds, another team, they could really use a nice, impactful bat in their lineup. Sure, they probably would have a little bit of an issue at third base with Mike Moustakas there already, but if the universal DH goes universal, maybe you stick one of them at DH and you put the other one at third base, and you just interchange them, because you would have somebody that batted way better than Moustakas did this past year, and somebody that batted, pretty much better than Nick Castellanos, and those were the 2 big pickups for the Cincinnati Reds. But I think if you add Franco to that mix, I think that's just going to be an added bat. Also, Eugenio Suarez is also there still, so you'd have 4 legitimate batters. Again, we saw this past year, you don't have to get it done with superstars. The Tampa Bay Rays went all the way to the World Series, and they didn't necessarily have any superstar, hitters. So, again, those would be 4 very solid hitters for the Reds, and I think that they could potentially go very far if they were to pick up somebody like him. And then the Blue Jays, again, if you're able to land that good of a corner third baseman, you add, Gurriel and Hernandez and Guerrero and, obviously Bo Bichette, like I mentioned, for, Hanser Alberto. Again, it could be just another added piece in that lineup, and I think that if you can bring in somebody like that, it could really step up the level of play. Not to mention the Blue Jays are kind of one of these teams that they're on the come up, and I think that they've even mentioned they want to spend some money this offseason. So who knows? They could go after a big name, add somebody huge, and then get Franco for a very good price and a really good contract and not have to spend a whole bunch of money and get a lot of production out of him. So wherever Franco goes, I think that he's going to be a very, warm welcomed player into any really lineup, in all honesty. So the next guy I want to discuss, and I briefly mentioned him in the first segment, and that's Eddie Rosario. As I mentioned, we already saw some teams have shown some interest in him already, and even though you look at his career numbers, and they've trended downwards over the last few years, his OPS numbers have stayed fairly consistent. I mean, they've also taken a little bit of a dip, but they haven't taken as big of a dip as his average has. And his OPS plus numbers have been actually pretty solid across the board. So, I mean, he hasn't really been, again, a superstar, but he's been somebody that I think a lot of teams would have no problem adding onto their lineup. And one of the more popular, second-tier free agents, 1 year removed from a career-high year with 32 homers and 109 RBIs. So, again, he's capable of big numbers. And if you really add that onto any lineup, especially a contending team like the Red Sox, I mean, I think it would be a very different situation in the AL East next year if he were to actually make his way to Boston, because I think that he would be exactly what they need, kind of that added. Again, a lot of these guys would just be that extra kind of push that some of these teams need, that extra cushion that they need, that extra, hey, you know what, we've already got our superstars, but we're going to just add him in kind of as a safety net, if you will. And if things go wrong, we've got him hitting, fifth or sixth in the lineup, and all of a sudden we've set ourselves up into a better situation. I mean, his numbers aren't necessarily drastically decreasing, right? From 2017 to 2020, his average has gone from 290 to 288 to 276 to 257. So it's stayed in relative, from that 250 to 300 level. And obviously his first 2 years, it was 267, 269, and then that big jump to 290. So kind of seen a little bit of a quick ascension and then a little bit of a slow downward trend right now. But again, I think that with this season, it was a little odd, it was a little weird, but I think that ultimately, he's going to be somebody that is going to go back to those 2019 numbers. Not to mention, I mean, he had 3 straight years of 24 or more home runs. I mean, he had 24 in 2018, he had 27 in 2017, and I mean, he had 70-plus RBIs in both seasons. So he's capable of big power-hitting numbers, and he's capable of really driving in runs, being a run producer. I think maybe the Rangers could go after him. I mean, they definitely need power in the outfield with, Chu possibly departing in free agency. Could be, again, picked up for a very low price. I also think the Royals, if you add Michael A. Taylor in the outfield right now, you need some hitting, no question. I mean, you need some hitting really, really bad. Michael A. Taylor is going to give you a lot more of defense and a lot less of offense. And I think that's why a team like the Royals would really benefit if they could go get somebody like Eddie Rosario. And who knows? The Royals could be plotting their next big kind of window of opportunity to win by getting some of these, forgotten, if you will, free agents. And I think that, again, Rosario could eventually become a DH, so you could stick him in the outfield, you could put him as a DH, one of the two. But he's definitely got the numbers to be very good, and he's definitely got the numbers to be somebody that a very highly sought-after, free agent in this year, without question, honestly. And the next guy I want to discuss, kind of a bigger name, somebody that's a little bit more popular, Kyle Schwarber. That was a little bit of a shock for me when I saw that the Cubs were going to just let him walk. And again, another player that has seen a big downward trend in his career, and it's really been all over the place, I think. He batted a career low 188 this past year, minus the 2 games he played in 2016. That was technically his career low, but again, he only played 2 games, so are we going to really hold it over his head? But I think that Schwarber has so much potential, and I think that's what's very aggravating about him, is that he's got so much potential, but he doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't actually put, the ball in play. He doesn't actually put his bat on ball. I will say, though, he had a monster season in 2019. 38 homers, 92 RBIs. He did bat .250, but he had a career high in OPS at .871, and his 38 homers and 92 RBIs were all career highs. So he did have a career year in 2019. And again, I need to kind of get myself out of this notion of if you're batting below 285, you're not that great of a hitter, because baseball is not going in that direction anymore. You have to look at the OPS numbers a lot more, home runs, the RBIs, things like that, the slugging numbers. And his slugging percentage was through the roof in 2019 as well. So I think that he could be a hot commodity for a lot of teams because he does have the potential to be very good. And, I mean, he put up 2 straight years of 800-plus OPS. He also had, from 2017 to 2019, he had 2 of those 3 years with 30-plus homers as well. So he's definitely a capable power hitter. It's just that his poor production recently is what's really, I think, kind of setting him back. But he's got such a high potential. Now, going back to the Cleveland Indians, again, I'll keep bringing them up because they don't want to spend a whole lot. A lot of these players, they can probably spend a fraction of what they would have to for other guys, especially someone like Francisco Lindor. And not to mention, they need power hitting in the outfield. They need that. And I think Schwarber brings that. He's not a great fielder. I mean, you watch him in the outfield, and he is very poor at reading fly balls. He either is too aggressive with charging them or he overruns them, whatever. He's not great at fielding. But I think that, with, Alex Gordon retiring and then Bubba Starling performing horrendously for the Royals, that's another team that could potentially, really use some power hitting in the outfield. Like I mentioned, the Indians and the Royals, these are going to be two teams, I think, in the AL Central that are going to try and go after some of these lower rung second tier free agents because they know that this is kind of, again, a window of opportunity, if you will, for these teams that could go after players that would probably in other years ask for a larger sum of money. I mean, let's think about it. Kyle Schwarber put on an absolute show in the World Series in 2016, 2015, whatever. I think it was 2016, and absolutely put on a performance and a half. But and in a lot of sense, you could say he's got the potential, and I think that in any other situation, if there's no pandemic, there's no financial loss, and all this other stuff that's been going on, he'd probably ask for a lot of money, but I think he's aware that he can't really ask for that right now. So I think the Indians and the Royals would be two interesting places for him to wind up. I don't think he's going to get a large contract, but with the potential that he's got, with the home run hitting ability that he has, and the potential to be, a run producer for any team, I think that's going to really draw a lot of eyes onto Kyle Schwarber. Next guy, another outfielder. We're going to keep going back with these outfielders. A lot of them wound up getting non-tendered. I was actually very, very shocked. Brian Goodwin. And I think Brian Goodwin is a sneaky good player. I think he's, in my opinion, one of the more reliable leadoff hitters. If you stuck him at a leadoff role in any lineup, he's going to be very good for you. He's going to be very productive. It might not be great with drawing walks. Might not be great with, hitting home runs. But if you need a slap hitter who's going to at least be, an imposing presence at the plate for an opposing pitcher, and somebody that an opposing pitcher would be somewhat worried about and say, okay, if this guy gets on base, who knows what's going to happen because he could advance, he could, and sure, he's not, again, if you look at his numbers, you look at his career numbers, they're not staggering, right? I mean, in 2020, he batted .215, 2019, he batted .262, 2018 batted .266, and then 2018, in 2018, he batted .239, but he batted .262 in 2019. So, a big jump from 2018 to 2019, and then a huge digression from 2019 to 2020. So he's coming off a career season, though, in 2019 because, again, only 30 years old or so, and he's batted .262. That was his career high. I'll take that. I think that's, again, not necessarily proven him to be worth a lot of money, but I think that he could be, an added piece in any real lineup. Not to mention he brings experience. He brings some leadership to the table. He's not a great fielder. He's got a decent bat that could, again, be a solid leadoff spot for some teams. Where he could land, probably the Pirates again. This is somebody that I could see winding up on the Pirates for a very low cost, for a very, very low contract. He could provide leadership for a very young outfield. I mean, they've got a very young outfield. And I think that bringing in somebody like Brian Goodwin is going to do a little bit better than bringing in somebody like Jarrod Dyson. I think that Goodwin is way better than Dyson. Obviously, Dyson is probably a better fielder, but I think Goodwin overall is a better player. And not to mention, you need somebody to tutor, Reynolds. You need somebody that's going to take Tucker under their wing, especially if Tucker is going to be changing positions and going out into the outfield instead of the infield. He's had every year, Goodwin has had a negative defensive WAR, so he's not a great fielder at all. But he could, again, be a very solid piece in someone's lineup potentially. And I could see him having somewhat of this effect of, as time goes on, he starts to get inserted onto teams' lineups, and he starts being a part of, some teams' big playoff runs. Kind of very similar to how we saw, I'm trying to think of some guys in the most recent years that, were picked up. They're kind of old. I mean, Howie Kendrick kind of comes to mind. Somebody that was picked up mid-season or right before the season, later in his career, later in his years, but he had a wild career resurgence, and he was vital to the World Series for the Washington Nationals. Same thing with Brian Goodwin. I think we could see that out of him potentially, maybe not this year or for a couple of years, but maybe down the road, he could be somebody that's career is revitalized a little bit and they go somewhere. I mean, again, Charlie Morton, another team that or another guy that, again, all the way up until about 2018, he wasn't really doing anything spectacular. He gets put on to the, Houston Astros. They win the World Series in 2017. He has back-to-back All-Star years in 2018, 2019, and all of a sudden he's got a career resurgence. So Goodwin could be somebody like that, but where he'll land, I have no idea. I don't think that he's going to be as highly sought after as someone like Eddie Rosario, but I definitely think that Goodwin will land somewhere decent at least. The last guy I want to discuss, NL Comeback Player of the Year a couple years ago, David Dahl, former All-Star. He could be, in my opinion, one of the biggest gets on this list, maybe the biggest. I mean, if a team were to land Dahl, I think that they would be sitting real pretty. I mean, he's coming off a 2019 year where he was an All-Star. He batted .302. He had a .524 slugging percentage, .877 OPS, 15 homers, and 61 RBIs. And he did a lot of damage for the Rockies. And again, Comeback Player of the Year. He had 16 homers and 48 RBIs in 2018. I will say, he's coming off an awful year. In 2020, I mean, he did not bat above 200. He's got the star potential, and he's got the capabilities of being somebody that could be really, really good, and you could maybe find him on a contending team. Again, he could be somebody like a Franco who could be added onto a contending team that's got some superstars on it. Could also be someone like, who knows, maybe like a Hanser Alberto, another guy that could maybe be put onto a contending team and really be that kind of added piece somewhere down the road. But I think that, Dahl is getting a little overshadowed by all these other talented players. I think if this wasn't such a huge free agency market this year, I think Dahl would be one of the bigger names. And again, this was definitely not the year he wanted to have going into free agency. Similar to Kyle Schwarber, not really making your case very legitimate in trying to get a lot of money. I could possibly see Dahl landing on a team like the Tigers. I mean, they are able to make, some moves there. Maybe they could pay him a little bit. They could if they were to get rid of Cabrera or he retires over the next few years, that'll really free up some payroll, so they won't have to pay that contract as much. And they definitely add a reliable, consistent hitter with Dahl, and they could, he could prove to be a difference maker. And I think that Detroit also, another team that's got a lot of pieces that they could work with, and it's just a matter of what they're going to do with that. But again, with his potential, I think that Dahl will land on somewhere pretty solid, probably more solid than a lot of the other guys on this list. But we'll have to see where really all these guys are going to land, because we've now entered into one of the probably larger free agent markets that I can remember, with just a mass exodus of players. So we're going to see a lot of new faces and new places next season, and I'm very excited to see where these guys land and what kind of teams they call their new home for next year. So that will close things out here for us in our second segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. After the break, I'm going to get into some of the recent financial struggles this past year of the MLB and how the league financially will look next year and really moving forward from here. It's been a lot of fun so far, but we got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenauer again, and in the last segment I got into discussing some of the newest additions to the free agency market and which teams might take advantage of these newcomers in free agency. I want to now dive into discussing what baseball financially looked like this past year and really currently today, and then where they might wind up after this offseason and what the MLB will do to really correct this financial problem that they've been having. And really, it's been induced because of this pandemic. As we know, I mean, this pandemic has really just affected everything. And baseball this past year, I mean, they took a real big hit. And I remember when they were first trying to figure out the collective bargaining agreement, they were trying to figure out the start date to the season, all kind of the ins and outs of this year. They could not come to an agreement. And I remember seeing a lot of things that if baseball doesn't start soon, they're going to lose massive amounts of money. And they actually did lose quite a bit of money. I mean, between the 30 teams, there's about $8.3 billion of debt from different lenders, and they'll have to post about $2.8 to $3 billion in losses in total. And in general, I think they actually also lost about $3.1 billion as a whole. So losing $3 billion. And I was actually reading an article, a lot of people were saying, people will say, well, these billionaires, they can take that hit. And these articles said it's easier said than done. That's not necessarily the case. That's a lot of money for some of these owners and these teams to lose. And it's really affected baseball, not to mention, before this pandemic, baseball was not really in a great financial situation. I mean, baseball's overall attendance in general has been going down each and every single year. Actually, it's dropped each year over the last 5 seasons. So, I mean, that's a huge, huge decline over the last couple of years. And especially for America's pastime, it's kind of unfortunate to see that. I mean, being a baseball fan like myself, growing up and watching baseball, going to games constantly, I mean, you kind of are, your head scratches as to why people aren't going to games more often. It's the main sport of the summer. Nobody else is playing. There's no other athletics going on. So it just has always kind of been an interesting and intriguing thing to me that baseball continues to lose money and lose people's interest. And I know that they've tried to meander their way through with changing rules and adding new things and taking things out, and the universal DH obviously this year, having the pitch count having the clock for the pitcher, how many seconds it takes for them to get back onto the mound and get back into a set and everything else. So they've tried to do things to make baseball a little bit more appealing and a little bit more not as slow and drawn out like a lot of these people think it is. And in all honesty, I don't blame the MLB for doing that. I definitely think that is a very fair and logical thing to say that, we need to do some changes. We need to switch baseball up a little bit. But at the same time, you have to keep it unique. You have to keep it baseball. And I think that some of the rules that they've tried to implement kind of takes away from what baseball is. But I know that they're doing it for a financial reason, and there's obviously things that, they understand much more than I do. But think about all of the losses that the baseball teams and really just the MLB had this year. You had concession stands gone, drinks, food, beverages gone. You had merchandise at the team stores gone, ticket sales gone. You had all of that just out of the window, could not pay it. And I actually, again, I brought this up many times, but it's because he's the only one that I know who has gone to a professional sporting event during this pandemic. My buddy who went to the World Series, I mean, he paid an arm and a leg for tickets. And he was saying that tickets were going at the highest. I think he said you have to buy them in fours. You have to buy them in a pod, they call them, and you have to buy them in fours. And I think that a group of 4 tickets is over $1,000, if not more. And that's probably going to be a generic price for some of these seasons, and for some of these teams coming up this year. If they're allowed to have fans back, they're going to put a large price on it because they have to cover their losses. And I was actually reading a couple other things where Rob Manfred was saying that if baseball were to have a similar season that it did this past year, it could be detrimental to baseball. And I immediately, obviously went worst case scenario when you read that and you're like, well, what's going to happen to baseball? Is baseball going to crumble? Are they not going to have baseball anymore? Is baseball going to become obsolete? I really don't think that could ever happen. I really don't think that in any lifetime we could see a sport go obsolete because of financial reasons, because there's going to be so many players that are going to try and keep it around. There'll be things done that will stop baseball from ultimately crumbling to the ground if that were to happen. But I really don't think that will, because, again, they're spending so much time right now on it. They're probably going through business plan after business plan. And, I mean, sure, another season like this could pose massive issues. But if the vaccine comes out and then, teams start implementing, hey, you have to get tested or you have to be vaccinated or whatever it might be in order to go to these sporting events, things are going to open back up to normal. Things are going to go back to normal. And so as a result, baseball will go back to normal. And I know that this year they really tried to correct this, and they really tried to figure out ways that they could keep fans engaged and keep fans intrigued and interested in the team and really still supporting it. I know there was a large emphasis on kind of trying to keep season ticket holders interested and keeping their interest at a high level, and they did the cardboard cutout with the fans. I know that the Pittsburgh Pirates, they did something very, very unique, where they did basically, if you had a baseball hit your cardboard cutout, they would send a letter to you with the baseball saying, hey, your cardboard cutout was a lucky winner of a baseball or whatever, and they would send it to you in the mail. So teams got creative, and I definitely think that, I know that there were some teams that were charging an absolute fortune for a cardboard cutout. I think that the Dodgers, they thought about having, I think, cardboard cutouts go for anywhere between $125 a ticket to $225 a ticket. And you're just paying to have your cardboard cutout at a game. Who knows if you'll be able to be seen on TV, not to mention you're not actually there. Now, what I think what could have been very interesting that they could have done is this. Maybe they could have done something where they gave you an access code and they put little, and again, this would probably cost a fortune, but if there was some way where they could keep it at a very low cost and they had like these little kind of camcorders or camcorders or like these little laptop monitors that they put on each chair, and you'd have to pay a little bit extra for it, but you would be able to actually view the game from your seat as if you were there, but you're at the confines of your home. I think that would be something very interesting. I know that I've mentioned before teams maybe getting creative and trying to do kind of a, for fans that are outside of that market, paying a little subscription towards the team and saying, hey, because everything is subscription-based now. Hey, pay a little monthly fee or a seasonal fee or a game fee or whatever it might be, nothing crazy, but in order to access your team, and be like you're at the game, you have to pay this access code. I think that would be very interesting to do. But I think that they're really trying to bring in more money, and with the loss of ticket sales, I think that's been detrimental. And I think that if they are able to try and figure out somehow, some way where they could regain some of this money back. I know that TV deals is a huge thing. I know that Turner Sports has got a ginormous deal with the MLB right now, paying them hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Same thing with Fox. Fox has got a massive deal with the MLB. So, the MLB's got a lot on their plate. They really have a lot of people that are trying to make sure that they stay afloat and that, these situations don't come to a point where it's, oh my God, we don't have enough money to put together a season. Like, how are we, and kind of this issue of, I don't want to say like someone like the XFL, because obviously it's a little bit different because smaller league, a developmental league for a different sport, totally different situation. But something like that for baseball, that could be really scary. And not to mention, we have to also factor into this, minor league baseball. How many losses have they taken this year and how many hits they've taken? You already saw coming into the year, they were going to take some financial losses because of the 40 teams that were taken away in the farm system. But now you've had over 1,000 minor leaguers out of work. You've had, more teams start to get nixed and more teams starting to pretty much close up shop. And sure, the MLB has done a nice job, I think, recently with trying to bring that back out. You've got the Wood Bat League coming out. You've got a couple other things that are on the horizon for minor league baseball and for prospect baseball and such. But there's going to have to be something that they can try to do to try and offset this. I don't know if this would ever be a possibility, but could we see a day where baseball eventually gets a salary or a salary cap, and all of a sudden players are starting to make similar money to other athletes? Because in all honesty, baseball players make an abnormal amount of money. I know it's a 162-game season. I know that it's an everyday grind. And I know that it's a very, very challenging thing to do, being away from your family that often and being on the road constantly. But you're not necessarily putting your body into a physical toll that a guy like on a basketball team or a football team would do. Imagine playing a 162-game football season. You couldn't do that. Imagine playing a 162-game basketball season. You could also not do that. So, again, there's a reason why baseball is able to be played that much. Maybe we'll see a day where they nix some of those games and they bring it down from 162 games to, maybe 145 or 130, and then they start kind of, as years go on, dropping them down lower and lower. That could be a possibility. We could see baseball start to shorten its years. So, because if the players want to continue to make the same amount of money, then the owners will say, well, we're going to have to play a fraction of the games because we just can't financially afford to pay you guys this amount of money for this amount of games. So, and then obviously as a result, you've got players that are upset about that and this, that, and the other, and nobody's happy. So the owners and the players, I think, are going to be very key in the finances moving forward. And I think Rob Manfred, again, I have said this so many times, Rob Manfred needs to be the voice that steps in and says, this is what we're doing. He needs to take a role and take a leadership. I think recently he's been doing a little bit better, but he needs to be a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more of a leader instead of just kind of being, in my opinion, very passive. I think he's a very passive commissioner. So I think if he's able to try and take the bull by the horns and he's able to come to some sort of agreement, whether it's, okay, for the next 2 or 3 years, it's going to be a prorated salary. I remember they were talking about that, basically where they, pay you kind of on a tapering scale. Maybe they'll do that. Maybe contracts will be renegotiated where, it'll taper them. And they'll pay this amount of money for this year, but then if they're able to make this amount of money back, that is the team, then they can pay them a little bit more of that contract for the next year, or whatever it might be. I think you could also see teams not go after guys that have high value. I think that, again, we might see a couple years where some of these, lower market, mid-market teams, they can't afford these bigger name players. And then as a result, these bigger market teams, they can obviously pay for them. And so baseball becomes a little lopsided. It becomes very top heavy because of the financial situation. Another thing that I'm curious about is how long will it take for baseball to get out of this financial hole? And if it's going to be a 5-year plan, if it's a 10-year plan, if it's a 2-year plan, that's a lot of, again, other variables you have to put into it, whether or not they're going to pay managers on the same scale as players. Are front office executives going to be making as much money? And you're obviously going to have players that are going to speak up and say something about, if they don't feel like they're getting paid the fair amount of money or whatever it might be, rightfully so. If you don't feel like you're getting paid what you should be getting paid, you should speak up and say something about it. And I think that at the end of the day, again, I come back to Rob Manfred. Rob Manfred is going to be the most instrumental person in all of this if he can really bring baseball out of the dark ages. I mean, it's kind of in a dark age right now. And obviously, I mean, in general, we're kind of in a very bleak time, but again, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're around the bend. We're getting better. Things are on the up and up about, everything, I think. At least that's the opinion I take of it. But you still have to factor in that, baseball is still trying to scramble around. They're trying to still figure out just all this different, factors into the season. Now, here's another thing that I just thought of. And I don't know how much that this could play a role in, but I know the NHL has talked about doing an outdoor league for hockey. This could pose a massive problem for baseball because the grounds crew for baseball teams, they're going to want those hockey guys off the field if they have to use, an MLB field, which they probably will. I mean, they've done it before for these outdoor classics. So if they do that, and then what if we got an issue where it's the MLB versus the NHL? Who has more rights? Because the NHL could argue, well, this is technically our season. The MLB could say, well, we need time to prepare for this upcoming season. I mean, it could happen. It could definitely happen. That could be something that is talked about. I just hope that ultimately baseball in the next 5 years is able to get a better turnout, and that maybe some of these rules that are implemented and some of these new guidelines that the MLB is starting to implement, a universal DH, minimum of 3 batters faced for a pitcher, stuff like that, maybe that'll start bringing baseball back to life a little bit. People will like those rule changes, and it could change baseball for the better. I just hope that eventually something is done because, I mean, these financial losses, losing billions of dollars and still having these hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts on a yearly basis with these huge broadcasting networks, I mean, it's not a good recipe for the next couple of years financially. So hopefully they can figure it out because I would really, really hate to see baseball go by the wayside. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. Thanks for sticking around, but stay right there because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, which will include me discussing a hypothetical scenario, which is which pitcher would you rather have to start in a playoff game. I will give a couple candidates before selecting who I would want in that situation. Don't go anywhere, everyone, because we've got one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the previous segment, I got right into discussing the recent finances of the baseball year and really baseball this past season and what the future holds financially for the MLB. I want to close out the show today discussing which pitcher I would rather have to start a playoff game. Who would I trust the most in a situation where I needed a win in the series and I had to throw my go-to guy on the mound? So I'll mention a couple guys, and then I'm going to dive into which one I would probably want in the most ideal situation. So the first guy I've got to mention is Clayton Kershaw. I mean, I know that he's gotten a lot of flack over the years, and I know that he's gotten a lot of negative notoriety, if you will, for his performance in the playoffs. But in all honesty, this past year, the guy actually set a couple records. One of them being he's now holds the record for most career strikeouts in a postseason career with 206 and counting. So he's actually, funny enough, he's had a very illustrious career in the playoffs. Now, that probably has a lot to do with the fact that he's played on the Dodgers. He's got a ton of experience pitching in that situation. He's been on the large stage before. He's pitched in World Series. He's pitched in Championship Series. He's pitched in Division Series. He's pitched in it all, except for probably a wild card game. Well, he's actually pitched in one wild card game. So he's pitched in every single level of baseball, and I think that he's definitely a guy that you would want to throw on the mound in a situation where it's, who do I need to go to if I need to get a win, if I absolutely need to keep my team's chances alive in this situation and in this series, who am I going to go to? This past year arguably was one of his best seasons in the playoffs, really since 2013. I mean, his ERA stayed below 4 for the entirety of the playoffs. He has not done that since, again, 2013. As we saw in 2019, he really struggled. I mean, he had a 7.1 ERA, and then in 2018, a 4.2 ERA in the entire playoffs. He wound up having, he has got a 4.19 ERA in his career in the playoffs. Again, 207 strikeouts now, and then only 50 walks. So a pretty solid ratio from strikeout to K, or walk to K, or strikeout to walk ratio. So something that is, again, something to pay attention to. Now, he's given up a decent amount of home runs over his playoff career. I mean, 28, not a crazy amount, but there's been some years where he's really struggled with that issue. Now, there's also been some other years where he's really struggled ERA-wise, as we see in 2014. I mean, he had a 10.8 ERA after the first game he played, or he started in, and then the next game he started in, he had a 7.82 ERA. So that's really not averaging out to something very good at all. Now, we do see in 2013 that was probably his best year in the playoffs in an entirety. Obviously, he played 2 more games or so, or 1 more game in 2020 than he did in 2013. So it's kind of give or take with him, right? I think that he's definitely, he's a very capable pitcher of winning in the big moments. I mean, he's a Cy Young winner. He's been a multiple-time All-Star. He's won a Triple Crown before. He's won the MVP before. So somebody that has definitely been able to do a lot of damage. He's got a great deception with his windup, which I've always felt was honestly the reason why he's so good is that nobody knows what he's throwing. People don't realize that a pitcher's rotation is everything for a lot of reasons, and one of them is being able to not tip off your pitches. And, I think that is kind of the main thing with some pitchers is that some guys know that you're going to throw a changeup. Some guys know that you're going to throw a fastball. But he keeps his windup very consistent, and I think that is a big key in his success. He's had a lot of injury problems, so that is something to pay attention to if you were to look into the situation of, okay, who do I need to go to in this situation? He might be injured. He might have an injury issue. So I definitely think that, obviously the records and accolades and the experience all back up him being a playoff starter, but you also have to factor in he has struggled in the past. He has had problems in previous seasons with giving up a lot of runs, giving up a lot of hits. I mean, this past year, he did a pretty solid job. I mean, there was only one game where he gave up 7 hits, and everything else was, 6 and below. I mean, he had a game where he gave up only 3 hits, a game where he only gave up 2 hits, but there's been other seasons where, he's given up at least 2 hits in every single game that he's pitched, or he's given up at least, 4 hits in every single game that he's pitched. I mean, 2014, again, would go back to that year, it was an absolutely atrocious year for him. And I think that, in those 2 games he had 10 Ks and 9 Ks respectively in the 2 games he started, but a 10.8 ERA and a 7.8 ERA, that is not acceptable at all. So definitely would think about starting Kershaw. I mean, he's definitely one of the more power pitching pitchers in the MLB, one of the better pitchers in the MLB, and somebody that is going to probably eventually be a Hall of Famer without question. If you win 3 Cy Youngs, an MVP, an 8-time All-Star, and a Triple Crown, you're probably going to be in the Hall of Fame. So I'm going to go with one of them being Clayton Kershaw. I'm not going to say he's my selection, but I'm going to go with him. My next guy that I would go to, possibly Max Scherzer, obviously. Does not have nearly as much experience as a Clayton Kershaw. Very similar accolades, 3-time Cy Young. He's a 7-time All-Star. He's won a World Series. He's never won an MVP, but he's still been very, very good in his career as well. 2019, he had a pretty solid playoff run as the playoffs got deeper and deeper. And I think that is something to pay attention to about Max Scherzer, is that he seems to, for the most part, his number seems to, increase. Or at least get better as the playoffs go on. And in 2019, that was the case. I mean, after his first start, he gave up a 5.4 ERA, and then his last start, it was all the way down to a 2.4 ERA. So a whole 3-run difference in his ERA from his first start in 2019 of the playoffs to his last start. Again, a great sign to have. Same thing in 2017. I mean, very similar, although it trended in the other direction, it still stayed below 4. In 2016, another case. He had 6 ERA in his first start, and then he went to a 3.75 ERA in his second start. So he is able to progress forward and really kind of improve as the playoffs go on. He's got experience also pitching in a World Series. He's capable of being in that big stage. And he's actually been a winner of World Series games. Now, he's only won 1 World Series game, but I still think that at the end of the day, a one win is better than no wins. And he's only pitched in a couple World Series games, but again, he's pitched in numerous, playoff situations. And in all honesty, he's not that far behind in career strikeouts against Clayton Kershaw. He's got 137 career strikeouts. Not to mention, he's got a better career ERA in the playoffs than Clayton Kershaw does, with a 3.38 clip. So a guy that does a pretty solid job at limiting runs and keeping the strikeouts pretty high. And he's got a couple less walks than Clayton Kershaw does as well. So in all honesty, I think Scherzer and Kershaw are 2 guys that would definitely be at the top of my list in terms of who I would want going in a decisive game or in just a general playoff game. And I think that he's somebody that, if you look at 2019, again, I hate continuing to bring it up, but that was the year that the Nationals won the World Series, and that was really the best he pitched. I mean, he started in 4 games, and he had only 1 no decision. It was a hold. He actually only pitched that 1 inning. So he actually started in 5 games, excuse me. He started in 5 games. He picked up 3 wins. He was 3-0, did not get a loss the entire time. And not to mention, every game that he pitched in, they won. Whether it was 1 inning or 7 innings, it didn't matter. Every game he pitched in, the Nationals won. So again, that should show you something about Max Scherzer. The problem with him is this. He is very, very prone to giving up a large amount of runs in a half inning, in a bottom half or in a top half. I've mentioned this before, he's one of those one-hit pitchers where if it takes 1 hit, and then all of a sudden that ERA that they had at 2.5, 2.8 skyrockets to 4.2, and everyone's saying, well, he's such a good pitcher. Why is his ERA so high? It's because he's a one-hit pitcher. He gets 2 guys on base, and he surrenders a home run. All of a sudden, he's given up 3 runs off of just 1 hit, though, in that bottom inning. But then usually Scherzer settles down after that. He's able to kind of get into a groove, and he's got great deception with his pitching, very similar to Kershaw, except not as much with the windup. It's more so the actual pitches that he's throwing. I think that he could be somebody that could really do a lot of damage in any sort of playoff situation. So I would definitely start him in a playoff scenario. My next guy, obviously, Justin Verlander. I mean, Kershaw, Verlander, and Scherzer are 3 clear-cut decisions that I would make in terms of who I would want starting in a playoff game, at the bare minimum. And Verlander, similar to Kershaw, similar to Scherzer, another guy that really, he brings the heat. He probably, you could argue that he throws a little bit harder than Kershaw maybe, especially with all the injuries that Kershaw's had. But Verlander's also had a lot of problems himself. I mean, he was out this entire year with an injury. He's also a Cy Young winner. He's a Triple Crown winner, an MVP. So, again, a third pitcher that has, been at least a Cy Young winner and a Triple Crown and an All-Star, very similar to the last two, except, Max Scherzer, not getting the illustrious Triple Crown. He's still won one or two more Cy Youngs than one more Cy Young than Justin Verlander has. But, again, three very, very similar pitchers in a lot of senses. And I think that having Verlander in was going to do a lot of justice because he's had the most recent success, in my opinion, next to Kershaw, obviously, and Scherzer. But I think that in terms of, Verlander was virtually unstoppable in 2017 in the playoffs for the Astros. I mean, his ERA, when the highest it went was a 3.12. It was never was higher than that. I mean, he absolutely just dominated in 2017. Now, in 2019... it was a very steady year for him. I mean, he had the first game that he started, didn't give up a single run. Then his ERA jumped up to 3.3, then back down to 3.1, then 3.7, 4.1, 4.3. So it fluctuated a lot in 2019. He's also getting older, as is Scherzer and Kershaw. All three of them are getting older, but that's the beauty of being a pitcher. You can pitch later into your career and not really have to worry about anything. Now, if you do get a very detrimental injury, then that could definitely pose a lot of issues. I would say that if any of them had a serious injury and had to get another Tommy John surgery, that would probably be the end-all, be-all for their career, or really just their prime, if you will. But the issue with Verlander is he is also very susceptible to giving up a lot of runs. I mean, in the first 2 years that he was in the playoffs, in 2006 and 2011, his ERA was everywhere. It never dipped below 5. It was 5 and above the entire time. So, I mean, and that's 5 games, and that's 10 games that he pitched in. Or excuse me, that's 8 games that he pitched in a course of 2 years of the playoffs, and his ERA was above 5 the entire time. Not really numbers that you would usually see, not very characteristic at least, of a Cy Young winner, and that is a multiple Cy Young winner. Now, in 2012, it went way back down. I mean, this was probably the best year that he's had pitching in the playoffs in only 4 games. His ERA never touched higher than 2.2. It was 1.2, then the next game it was 0.5, then 0.7, and then 2.2 again. And mind you, he only had 1 game in that 2012 playoffs where he pitched under 4 innings. So he's going 7 innings, 9 innings, 8 1/3, going deep into the game, and he's surrendering little runs, very little runs. And he's going up against very good teams. I mean, that 2012 postseason, in that World Series, played against the Giants. Obviously, the Giants won it that year, but those were some very good Giants teams. The Yankees, the Athletics. So he went up against some pretty formidable opponents and held his own. So Justin Verlander, definitely another guy that I would 100% consider. I think that very similar to Scherzer, he's very capable of giving up big-time home runs. He's kind of a big, home run surrendering pitcher, if you will. So I think that's definitely another thing to factor in with Verlander. But I think all in all three of them are very, very legitimate choices. Now, the last guy I'm picking, not nearly the level of career that the other three have had, but in the playoffs, you could argue that he's probably been as good, if not better, than them in at least the last 2 years of the playoffs, and that's Charlie Morton. Charlie Morton, again, a 2-time All-Star, a World Series champ. He played in the World Series this past year. His ERA is sensational in the last 2 years of the playoffs. In 2019, his ERA never went higher than 0.9. And then in 2020, his ERA never went higher than 2.7. It was actually at 1.8, then 0.9, 0.5, and then back up to 2.7. So Charlie Morton is, again, another prime example of somebody that you want to have in the game in a pivotal situation. Not to mention, I believe he's got the career high, or he's got the most ever wins in a starting situation in a game-deciding matchup in a series. He has the most wins for a starting pitcher. I think it's like 4 or 5, maybe 6, something like that. But he's won quite a bit of games in those game-deciding situations. And I think that's what is so unique about Morton, is that although he is getting older, although he is up in age, he is still somebody that is going to get the job done. He can get wins for you. He's probably a little bit more reliable of a winner in recent memory than the other three. I would not say that that in any sort of regard he's better than them, or that their numbers are not better than his. I mean, their numbers career-wise way better than him, and their playoff numbers are way better than him also. I still think that Charlie Morton should be given some recognition for this because he has been instrumental in the success of a few World Series contending teams. and I think that is what makes him so unique. Now, before 2019, not a very good playoff performer. I mean, in 2018, the one game he started, 11.5 ERA. 2013, the one game he started, he had a 3.1 ERA. So, again, it's kind of hit or miss all the way up until 2019, and then recently, he's just been on an absolute tear, and he's kind of come out of nowhere, if you will. I think that he's definitely somebody that you would want to take into consideration, but all in all, who I would ultimately want to have starting in this situation, I would probably go ultimately with somebody like, it's going to be hard. I'm probably going to go with somebody like Kershaw. I would go with Kershaw because of, again, obviously all the success he's had, the numbers he's put up, but the sheer experience. I think that is something that should definitely be taken into account heavier than the accolades and this, that, and the other. He has the experience playing and pitching in that very, very intense moment and very just nerve-wracking situation. He's capable of doing it. And so as a result, I think that he is the number one option to have to start in that case. I would not be too disinclined to put Charlie Morton as a close second. I think that, again, recently he's been somebody that you could argue is a reliable starting pitcher in a playoff game. He has done it, especially in game-deciding situations. He's really good at it. Scherzer and Verlander are two guys that I think that could also be very good, but I think just what worries me is that they have the capability of, again, being those one-hit pitchers where it just takes one big hit and that's all she wrote. And that is, instead of some of these other guys like Kershaw or Charlie Morton, where it's usually a hit after a hit after hit. It's a couple consecutive hits that really gets them into a hole. Scherzer and Verlander, it's just one swing and that's all she wrote. So I think that Scherzer and Verlander are still options that you would want to start. But in terms of just experience and just sheer will, I'm going with Kershaw and then a very close second, Charlie Morton. And then probably after that, probably Verlander and then Scherzer. I mean, it would be very close with who would be third and fourth. You could probably interchange the two, but it's not It's not by a landslide in any situation. I mean, all four of them would be ideal to have in any starting situation of a playoff. So that's just my opinion. A couple guys that I threw out, a couple guys that at least have made a lot of noise in the playoffs the last few years. But let me know who you think could be potentially a great starting pitcher to have in this situation, because there's probably numerous people that I left off this list, but just wanted to touch on a couple and really share what I thought, give some background, give some evidence, and then ultimately make my selection. So that'll wrap it up for us here today. Thank you again for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice little review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we'd really appreciate that. Thank you again, everybody, and until next time, keep on having a great day and keep staying safe and healthy.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.